Well, the biggest threat to the U.S. dollar dominance, I think, can be summed up with one acronym, and that acronym is BRICS. Although if you listen to the Western media talk about BRICS, they downplay its significance. The U.S. dollar is fine, nothing to see here. The rise of China, the rise of Russia, this partnership is of no concern to the United States. Really? That's really interesting. Last week in South Africa, the BRICS coalition of Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa saw its biggest expansion yet, adding 6 new countries to its expanding list. Journalist Mike Jones joins us now to look at the BRICS Summit, its larger implications. And Mike, I got to say, it is amazing to sort of look at the Western media coverage of this, in the United States at least. There's almost no coverage of it, very little coverage, and very little concern about the U.S. dollar dominance as it relates to BRICS. What are you seeing in terms of Europe and other parts of the world?
In terms of Europe, particularly I've looked at the British media today, The Guardian and The Independent, they have both got articles on it. Larry Elliott in The Guardian did talk a lot about the US hegemony and the dollar and its behavior in particular. Also referenced the behavior of the G7 and how this very exclusive sort of attitude and pushing away countries has perhaps helped BRICS and helped these nations that want to be a part of what is a very inclusive organization. President Putin, in his speech, talked about how one of its founding principles is cooperation and working with people. Back during the days of COVID, when the G7 countries hoarded the vaccines, it caused a lot of animosity among certainly the developing countries. Here we see particularly African nations benefiting from Russia and China investing in them. So there are these two very different and very polarizing aspects. But on that same tone, Putin has said that we are not against anyone. We are working with to raise people up and not sort of take commodities out of countries, which you can imagine was very positive for the African countries. But the coverage in the West that I've seen, as you say, minimalist, sort of downplaying it, talk of this single currency. The Larry Elliott in his article in The Guardian sort of said the talk of a single BRICS currency is for the birds.
This idea that, of course, and they've been doing this quietly since 2009, really, which has been buying up gold. And China and Russia have been buying up gold. They've been stockpiling gold. They've been, pushing towards this BRICS currency, which is backed by commodities, right? Actual tangible things that you can pull out of the ground, things that these countries are very rich in. The United States currency, of course, backed by nothing. It's backed by debt, actually, and military might. That's how the U.S. dollar is built. It's on debt and military muscle. And so for these BRICS nations to say, we want you to keep your sovereignty, we want you to keep your minerals, we're not going to come in and basically rape your countryside and steal your minerals, it seems like a breath of fresh air, no?
Absolutely. And you only need to look at the recent example of the French government's actions with Niger. Right. Niger rising up and kicking out the colonialist or former colonialist masters who were taking commodities out of their country, and this very aggressive action. And this comes down to energy, which is a big part of BRICS. We're talking not just nuclear, we're talking hydrocarbons, gas, oil, etc. Not just energy either, food as well. President Putin in his speech referenced the fact that the world's population is due to rise by 1.7 billion by, I think he said 2025. So the increase in energy demands, and that is kind of what BRICS is based on, many of these hydrocarbon producers and exporters. I think it was the Visual Capitalist who did a great rundown of the real ramifications of the addition of these 6 countries into BRICS. We're talking about 44% of the world's oil production. Now, as much as the Western media might like to downplay that, that's got to be of concern to certainly the US and the de-dollarization process of the petrodollar.
Yeah, it's a massive expansion. And I think looking at these visualization charts just really drives it home. I'm such a visual person, so when I see it in those stark terms, it's pretty remarkable. What were some of the other big takeaways? So we talked about the grain deal, we talked about Africa, and of course Putin doubling down on his position of like sovereignty in Africa, that we will cooperate, we won't come in and steal your resources. But of course you have this new expansion now, the 6 additional countries moving in, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. What were some of the other big takeaways to your mind covering this big event?
The big takeaways was also on a geopolitical and almost reconciliation sort of aspect, where with the addition of Iran and Saudi Arabia, these were two former rivals, and Joe Biden has done brilliant work in reconciling Saudi Arabia,
Right.
as it's been pointed out by others.
How are they friends now? I mean, this is unbelievable, right? And they're joining BRICS together. It's really a remarkable moment.
There we go. And I believe that's the role of China that has helped step in there as a mediator. Then if you look at China and India, now those are two sort of founding members of BRICS anyway, but they have their tensions as well, where Russia has been a mediator between those two countries. The Western media has liked to poke at that and say, oh, well, the more members you have, the more chances there are for disagreement and problems. But that doesn't appear to be the case in this multipolar world and how it's operating. So that is going to cause more concern. We then see the expansion into South America of Argentina. I believe they were brought on board at the request of Brazil. Mm-hmm. But these are economies with huge potential. Let's not forget Ethiopia. Its economy is in double digits. It had a lot of potential until recently. Iran as well. This new sort of trading bloc allows it to not, get outside of US sanctions, but now it has this potential trade boom that it can cooperate in. I saw a lot of Iranian products at the Army Expo Forum in Moscow. I'm not just talking about defense industry production, but we can talk about a lot more other commodities as well, that these countries stand to mutually benefit from with the inclusion of those. I think certainly adding in Argentina was a big one. Adding in Ethiopia was, I believe, South Africa's request. There's obviously more interest from other African nations. I believe, actually, the total of non-official interest in joining BRICS currently stands at 50 countries. The caveat to that is not all heads of state have actually confirmed that, but that gives you some idea of just how much weight is now getting behind this movement. Like it's been termed, it used to be a club. Now you're looking at a fully fledged organization, importantly, with its own bank. And even, as I say, Western media are acknowledging that in contrast to the IMF, that often has these crippling conditions in exchange for sovereign wealth, the BRICS Bank is almost no strings attached. I believe, was it not Janet Yellen who warned against dealing with the BRICS Bank, saying, just beware?
Yeah, just beware. And I'm not a believer in coincidences, because just as we have this meeting, this expansion of these BRICS nations, you see, of course, the United States ramping up again the rhetoric around China in the South China Sea. China must be challenged. Of course, that came this weekend. We see the trouble in the Philippines unfolding. So I don't think that this is a coincidence that you're starting to see the United States really push for agitation with China, because you listen to any U.S. official, they're playing out these war games in the United States against China by 2025. They're predicting a war with China. We need to take military action against China. This is their biggest threat. They've long said it. And I think you're seeing it now more than ever with this expansion of BRICS. I'm curious, talk about the military support here, because you have these countries now joining this. What sort of a military kind of friendly relationship will they have with Russia and China if there's U.S. meddling in their territories?
That's a really good question. If you think of all the meddling that happened quite close to the U.S. in South America, those countries, they're not going to be too happy about it. Africa, I don't think Somalia has been particularly pleased with U.S. meddling there either.
Airstrikes over the weekend, killing 13 people in Somalia, right? So the amount of meddling in Ethiopia, the list is endless. So you expand into BRICS. Does that offer some sort of a godfather protection against the United States meddling?
Let's look at Africa as an example with Wagner in its presence there, especially with Niger, Burkina Faso, the very friendly relations that Africa has built with Wagner, and by extension then Russia as well. It's difficult to say with any certainty, but you can see how sort of behind the scenes certain mechanisms can be employed if you are leaning towards this direction. And I'm sure that under the table there are agreements that can and will be made in that regard. So I think I think this is kind of almost karmic now. We've had since the Second World War this behavior, this domination of the petrodollar, but certainly this bullying behavior that President Putin called out in his speeches at the BRICS Summit, not just then, but on many occasions before. This is really resonating with these nations. And again, I'll reference the fact that the G7 and the G20 are very exclusive. These have to be leading industrial economies, generally looking at finance markets, not really anything that's useful for developing countries, even like Indonesia as well, which has been expressing an interest, I believe, in BRICS too. These economies actually want something useful and to be a part of something that benefits them. And we're seeing these different, like Ethiopia, I believe, could also be a big food producer as well. Egypt needs food. Russia, a big food producer. So there's just logical relationships that will form there and, of course, form bonds, which then help with this mutual cooperation to build a far more prosperous world outside of the indebted enslavement that the US seems to impose wherever it goes, and the G7 seems to represent, and the likes of Trudeau in Canada in their rhetoric, talking about exploitation of these smaller developing nations.
I'll get you out of here on this, Mike. You live in Russia. How is the Russian media covering the events of South Africa and the expansion of BRICS? And what do the people, just at cafes and in Moscow and walking around talk about and seeing this expansion of BRICS? How is it being played there?
Obviously, it's very positive. Obviously, I went to the Russia-Africa Summit as well. So given that this was chaired by South Africa, Africa was quite a heavy focus on it. It's obviously very positive because, once again, Putin's words are now ringing true and bearing fruit, if you like. We've talked in the context of the special military operation in the years where he warned about the West's behavior and their deceit. Now that's sort of spilling out and over into the world of these other countries that are acknowledging the truth behind what he's warned about. Then take it further with these alternative systems and deals, trade agreements, investments overseas. They're all bearing fruit now. So this is all very positive for not just the Russian economy either, but these member states as well. So it's kind of reinforcing the truth, the policy, and the direction that Russia is going in. And it doesn't matter how much the West screams and cries that the economy is in tatters. It's not. It's growing. And people's lives are getting better and better as a result of this guidance and this leadership.
This cannot be sitting well in Washington. We'll be covering it very, very closely. It'll be interesting to see what the Western response is, because they can't be sitting. They've got to have a plan here. They've got to be sitting back thinking, we've got to do something about this. You're literally watching the collapse of the U.S. dollar. It's not going to happen overnight, but the foundation is now laid, and this expansion is a major threat to U.S. dollar dominance.
Annalena Baerbock, if I may just comment, to see a contrast in the German politics, she was very quick to downplay and brush this developments from BRICS off. And yet, I believe it was Reinhard Bütikofer, the same member of her party, talking about what a massive geopolitical shift this is and will be, and the ramifications it will invariably have, particularly on Germany and the EU. And again, when we talk about Germany's position with gas and commodities, I'm more inclined to agree with Reinhard, who, as I stress, is a member of the same party as Annalena Baerbock.
Yeah, just look at the amount of money that they're now having to spend on fuel resources, and how many companies have now closed their doors because they can't afford the manufacturing, the fuel to keep their doors open in Germany. So I think you're right about that. Mike Jones, great to see you. Thank you for the insights on this BRICS Summit. This was the big one. This was the first big face-to-face meeting since the pandemic, now adding 6 new members to its ranks, with 40 to 50 more countries waiting in the wings to join it. This is a major moment. Mike, thanks. Great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Mike. It's interesting to think about some of the bullying that's taken place with, like, Mexico. Mexico was, of course, going to push forward with, BRICS membership. And then suddenly members of the United States Senate were like, hey, what if we invaded Mexico to take out those drug cartels? What if we started sending troops to Mexico? That was a veiled threat against them trying to align themselves with Russia and China and the BRICS nations.
Blurring the lines between, economic blocs and defensive military summits.
Yeah.
money is war at this point. Like it's hard to tell them apart.
But as someone in our Rumble chat here, see Vidar Ker Odinson. I like that, Odinson. By the way, isn't that like the Norwegian? You name your, if you are son of Odin and you're Odin's son.
Yes.
Yeah. So Vidar Ker Odinson in our Rumble chat says BRICS cannot even trade yet. Military alliance? Question mark. Ah ha 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 ha.
Right.
So very good point. But like, you have to think this has just started 2009. And look at how large this has already become.
Right.
And look at the size of the GDP of these BRICS nations compared to the United States, and how this is about to supplant the US dollar for settling in petrodollar versus the petrodollar and settling oil transactions. Like, yes, all of these pieces aren't here yet, but you're watching it unfold right before our eyes. So military alliance, how far off is that? I'd love to hear. Let me know in the chat. How far off do you think a military alliance is for some of these BRICS nations? As a hedge against NATO.
Well,
if we had not been bullies and the policemen of the world, we wouldn't be in this situation. It's because of anybody that borrows any kind of money from us, there's all kinds of stipulations. That it's kind of like The Godfather. I'm going to do you a favor, but I'm going to come calling, and when I come calling for a favor in return, you better be willing to do it, or we're going to, take your money and your resources.
Or there'll be a horse head in your bed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You wake up and see that. Yeah. So anyway, I'm fascinated by the BRICS. I think we're at a really interesting moment. And I think if you're not paying attention to what's happening with BRICS, you're missing the boat. I think it's a really, really fascinating moment and a really, really important moment for the US dollar.
Well, especially because the United States dollar is not backed by gold. It's backed by Saudi Arabian oil. And that alliance, right, to fall out of favor means that it's backed by even less. It really is like the rug coming out from under this global currency. Philip, what are you trying to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, Phil, it's not even backed by Saudi Arabian oil. I mean, yes, we settle transactions with the U.S. dollar in Saudi Arabian oil, in oil transactions as the petrodollar, but that ship has sailed. It's not even backed by that. It's only backed by debt. The U.S. dollar is only backed by debt and U.S. military force.
Right, but that alliance, which was sort of cheated out from under France and other countries that were competing to be the global dollar, the global currency, right, we've covered this before. And so it really is the rug being pulled out from under that currency. Philip, please go ahead and say what you're going to say. Hope you didn't forget.
Oh, I was just going to say that wasn't India just recently made like a major oil deal, something like $1 billion oil deal, and they paid in rupees. And it was like a huge to-do because they didn't pay in dollars. So, I mean, it's if you're thinking they can't trade, I mean, they kind of can. I mean, it's already happening.
Yeah.
Like once they start buying oil in rupees and rubles, that spells doom.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just reading Carol Roth's book over the break.
It's a new book. It's called You Will Own Nothing.
And she talks about, how this came about and how there were economists inside the U.S., inside the United States that absolutely did not want this because there is, I can't remember the name of the principle that you cannot, look out for your own interests and the interests of the globe at the same time. They're competing interests, and this was always going to spell certain death for the U.S. economy. I'm going to have to find what that economic principle is, but it's almost like it was unavoidable.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.